Hello there everybody, greetings and welcome to this new set of lecture for today. Group 1 is about to discuss on assessing listening. So this topic will cover on the importance of listening, the basic types of listening, the macro and the micro skills of listening, and lastly the designing of assessment tasks. Now under that we will also be talking about intensive, responsive, selective, and extensive listening. So this is the comprehensive summary of the topic that we are going to talk about today. Let's begin.
Good day, everyone. I'm going to talk about the importance of listening. It is stated that listening has often played second fiddle to its counterpart, speaking. So it means, generally, listening is given less importance than speaking. And it is rare to find just a listening task because listening is often implied as component of speaking. Listening is important because how could we speak the language without listening? Listening has the ability to understand the meaning of what you hear and will make you more knowledgeable and thoughtful person. In addition, the overtly observable nature of speaking renders it more empirically measurable than listening. There are certain cases where people spend too much time on speaking and as a result neglect listening. And that is why the speaking ability is more highly valued and more obvious than listening ability, and it's also easier to measure intuitively. However, there is universal bias towards speaking. People ask to determine if someone is a proficient user of a language, like, do you speak English? And people rarely ask, do you understand and speak English? These questions are common and they both involve the word speak, even though they typically imply listening ability as well. We normally don't ask about someone's listening ability in specific languages, probably because it's assumed that someone who can speak a language can also understand it to a similar degree. Normally, however, we do more listening than speaking in a typical day, whether in a workplace or home or anywhere. And one's oral production ability is only as good as one's listening comprehension ability. Therefore, we should pay close attention to listening as a mode of performance for assessment in the classroom.
As a continuation, I will be discussing on the basic types of listening. Now, when we design an assessment based on the listening performance, we need to first specify our objectives, narrow down your specific goals, and then classify your objectives based on the types of listening performances. I've been talking about listening performances. So what are these types of listening performances? When we listen to something, there are different processes that flash in our brain. First, we tend to recognize speech sounds and hold the temporary imprint of the things that we've heard in a short-term memory. We also determine the type of speech events that is being processed and attends to its context and content of the message. We also use bottom-up and top-down listening strategies. Now, when we say bottom-up, it's when we try to decode first the linguistic structure of what we've heard and then try to interpret the meaning of it. And top-down listening strategy is when we first recall our background information about what we've heard and then proceed to the interpretation of the meaning. And in most cases, we tend to delete the exact linguistic form and then just focus on the development of long-term memory. Say, for example, your teacher instructed you to tell your classmates about a particular guideline. Now, you don't have to say word by word as how the teacher told you in instructing your classmates. Why? Because you're not after the linguistic form, but you're after the message, the development of long-term memory. Alright, so these ways of listening performance can now be your basis in developing objectives for listening assessments. You can now look at the comprehension of surface structure elements such as phonemes, words, intonation, or a grammatical category. You can then consider the ability of the learner in understanding the pragmatic context, the ability of the learner to determine the meaning of auditory input, the ability of the learner to develop the gist or the global or the comprehensive understanding. Now, there are four basic types of listening performance which can be used in listening assessments. First, the intensive listening. Here you listen for perception for the components of a larger stretch of language. And second, responsive. It's when you listen to a relatively short stretch of language in order to make an equally short response. And third, the selective listening. It's when you process stretches of discourse, such as short monologues for several minutes. And then lastly, the extensive listening. It's when you try to listen and then develop a global understanding of the spoken language. That's the top-down strategy. Alright, so that's all for the basic types of listening and its relevance in listening assessments. Thank you so much for your time.
Good day, I am J.M. Andrada, and as a continuation to Jerwin Amarilius' report about the basic types of listening, I will be reporting about the macro and micro skills of listening. So what do you mean by macro and micro skills? Macro skills from the word macro, which means huge or the bigger picture of what can be done at a discourse level. On the other hand, micro skills from the word micro or very small details refers to skills that are relevant to what can be done at a sentence level or the technicalities in words or phrases. So there are 17 objectives in assessing listening. So under micro skills, first is discriminate or notice and understand that one thing is different from another thing among the distinctive sounds of English. Number 2, retain chunks of language of different lengths in short-term memory. So chunks, by the way, include lexical phrases or set phrases and fixed phrases. Like for example, the phrases utter disaster or by the way and at the end of the day. So those are examples of chunks. Number 3, recognize English stress patterns, words in stressed and unstressed positions, rhythmic structure, intonation, contours, and their role in signaling information. Number 4, recognize reduced forms of words or word formations that pertains to its morphological origin. Number 5, distinguish word boundaries, recognize a core of words and interpret word order patterns and their significance. Also pertains to word formations and origins. Number 6, process speech at different rates of delivery. And number 7, process speech containing pauses, errors, corrections, and other performance variables. So number 6 and 7 both refers to listening comprehension in speeches in any circumstances. And number 8, grammatical word classes. This is noun, verbs, and so on, systems, tenses, agreement, pluralization, patterns, rules, and elliptical forms. Some of you may not be familiar of elliptical form. So it pertains to sentences that are still understood even though some words are omitted. For example, Kate has 3 apples, Jane 4. So it's still understandable. So number 9, detect sentence constituents and distinguish between major and minor constituents. Just like what we did in our syntax class before, the tree diagram, where we determine the parts of the sentences. Number 10, recognize that a particular meaning may be expressed in different grammatical forms. And number 11, recognize cohesive devices in spoken discourse. So that's all for the micro skills objectives. So basically, number 12 to 17 are the macro skills. So number 12, recognize the communicative functions of utterances according to situations, participants, and goals. Number 13, infer situations, participants, goals using real-world knowledge. Number 14, from events, ideas, and so on, describe, predict outcomes, infer links and connections between events, deduce causes and effects, and detect such relations as main idea, supporting idea, new information, given information, generalization, and exemplification. Number 15, distinguish between literal and implied meanings. Number 16, use facial kinesics, body language, and other nonverbal clues to decipher meanings. So number 17, develop and use a battery of listening strategies, such as detecting keywords, guessing the meaning of words from context, appealing for help, and signaling comprehension or lack thereof. And now we're down to our next topic. So consider the following list of what makes listening difficult. So first is clustering, attending to appropriate chunks of language phrases, clauses, constituents. The next one is redundancy, recognizing the kinds of repetitions, rephrasing, elaborations, and insertions that unrehearsed spoken language often contains, and benefiting from that recognition. Yes, sometimes we find it hard to understand speeches that contains redundancy, especially when we listen to on-the-spot speeches or discussions. Redundancy is often observed. Number 3, reduced forms. Understanding the reduced forms that may not have been a part of an English learner's past learning experiences in classes, where only formal textbook language has been presented. Other terminologies that we haven't heard before because we are more exposed to formal word structures being taught by our teachers or what we read in books. Like for example, when a native English speaker talks to us and say, "I find our classmates so sus." Sus as in S-U-S. And we'll be like, "What is sus?" Then the speaker will have to give you the unreduced form of this word, which is suspicious. Number 4, performance variables, being able to weed out hesitations, false starts, pauses, and corrections in natural speech. When we listen to a discussion or a speech perhaps, there are these various factors that hinder us from comprehending what is being said. Like the interrupting pauses of the speaker when you're passionately listening and do not expect a pause on the speech. The next one is colloquial languages comprehending idioms, slang, reduced forms, shared cultural knowledge. This is one of the major issues in listening when you do not understand what the speaker is saying, when they use idiomatic expressions or figurative words. Number 6, rate of delivery, keeping up with the speed of delivery, processing automatically as the speaker continues. This happens most of the time when you're listening and the speaker talks way too fast that you find it hard to understand what they mean, and you try to process it in a faster way too, but you end up not absorbing some details. Number 7, stress, rhythm, and intonation. Correctly understanding prosodic elements spoken language, which is almost always much more difficult than understanding the smaller phonological bits and pieces. This is why stress, rhythm, and intonations are very important in speaking because it can cause confusion to the listener. And last but not the least, number 8, interaction. Managing the interactive flow of language from listening to speaking to listening and so on. So listeners sometimes find it hard to interact with the speaker when they are too determined to listen to the speaker. Sometimes they do not interact that much because they listen too much. They can't focus on what to reply to the speaker.
Once you have determined objectives, your next step is to design the task, including making decisions about on how you elicit a performance and how you will expect the test taker to respond. Intensive listening is a typical assessment that assesses phonological and morphological elements of language. Example tasks include minimal phonemic and morphological pair recognition. These assessments are great to assess students with past tense markers as well as stressed and unstressed parts of words. This type of assessment is not quite authentic but does serve the purpose for assessing parts of words. Students must listen carefully for components in a large stretch of language, such as phonemes, intonation, discourse markers, etc. The assessment example I am presenting is an assessment that recognizes phonological and morphological elements. The first one is recognizing phonological and morphological elements. This form of listening assessment assesses students' ability to correctly identify different phonemes and morphemes commonly found in English language. A classic test task gives a spoken stimulus and asks test takers to identify from two or more choices as in the following examples. The first table is an example of phonemic pair consonants. Test takers hear "he's from California." Test takers read A. He's from California and B. She's from California. The second table is an example of phonemic pair vowels. The test takers hear "is he leaving?" and the test takers read A. Is he leaving? Or B. Is he leaving? In both cases or examples, minimal phonemic distinctions are the target. The next example is the morphological pair ed ending. The test takers will hear "I missed you very much," and the test takers read "I missed you very much" or "I miss you very much." Hearing the past tense morpheme in the sentence challenge even advanced learners, especially if no context provided. Stressed and unstressed words may also be tested in the same rubric. The stress pattern in can't. Test takers hear "my girlfriend can't go to the party." The test takers read "my girlfriend can't go to the party" or "my girlfriend can go to the party." The reduced form or the contraction "cannot" is the one tested. Because it is decontextualized, these kinds of tasks leave something to desired in their authenticity, but they are a step better than items that simply provided a one-word stimulus. For example, in one-word stimulus, test takers hear "vine," but the test takers read "vine" or "wine." So those are the examples of phonological and morphological that are being tested in assessing students' listening skills. Now let's go to paraphrase recognition. Paraphrase recognition is a type of listening task that assesses the student's ability to listen to a short stretch of language and paraphrase it. This intensive listening task helps students understand the degrees of the English language and develops their ability to gather and understand information. This assessment task addresses listening comprehension of micro skills. Students listen to words, phrases, and sentences, then are asked to choose the correct paraphrase from a number of choices. This type of assessment focuses on students' ability to paraphrase the short sentences they hear. The first example of paraphrase is the sentence paraphrase. The test takers hear "Hello, my name is Keiko. I came from Japan." The test takers read or paraphrase it as "Keiko is comfortable in Japan." "Keiko wants to come to Japan." "Keiko is Japanese," and "Keiko likes Japan." In the example, the idiomatic "come from" is the phrase being tested. Another example of paraphrase is the dialogue paraphrase. The test takers hear "Hi Maria, my name's George." "Nice to meet you, George. Are you American?" "No, I am Canadian." Then the test takers read or paraphrase it as "George lives in the United States." "George is American." "George comes from Canada." and George is Canadian. In the example, the criterion is to sum it up, intensive listening assesses students on how they would recognize phonological and morphological differences when listening, as well as how they would comprehend sentences.
So, hello everyone, I am Jari May Ibailosis, and in continuation, the responsive is the third type of the basic listening skills. So, what is responsive listening? Responsive listening involves listening to a small amount of language such as command, question, comprehension check, or greeting. After listening, the student is expected to develop an appropriate short response. So we will examine two examples of the use of responsive listening. First is the appropriate or suitable response to a question. The objective of this example is recognition of the WH question, how much, and its appropriate response. Suitable response items often use multiple choice answers that the student select from in order to complete the question. Distractors are chosen to represent common learner error. A is responding to how much and how much longer. Letter C, confusing how much in reference to time versus the more frequent reference to money. And letter D is confusing a WH question with a yes or no question. Second is the open-ended response to a question. This time, test takers will write or speak their response. When an open-ended item is used in responsive listening, it involves the student listening to a question and provided an answer that suits the context of the question. Assessing an answer is determined by whether the student was able to develop an answer that is appropriate. The open nature of the question allows for creativity and expressiveness. So, responsive listening assessment allows a student to supply an answer to a question that is derived from what they were listening to. This is in many ways a practical way to assess an individual's basic understanding of a conversation.
Selective type of listening performance. Selective is a process that stretches discourse, such as monologues, for several minutes to scan certain information. The purpose of such performance is not to look for general meanings, but to stretch a spoken language, such as classroom directions, television, or radio stories. Selective listening assessment could be students listening to names, number, grammatical category, directions, such as in maps, or certain facts and events.
As the continuation, I am going to report about the extensive listening. Extensive listening is a way to practice your English listening skills. It means listening to many different recordings, videos, and interviews about the same topic. This will help you get context for what you are listening to and will help you learn more vocabulary. Dictation is a widely researched genre of assessing listening comprehension. It is used as assessment tools for decades. Dictations were thought to be not much more than glorified spelling tests. Huggies, Cohen, Bailey, and Bach all defend the possibility of dictation as integrative tests. Dictation tests can be easily manipulated by the length of the word group. Dictation is the process of writing down what someone else has said. With young children, dictation offers a way for a parent or a teacher to record a child's thoughts or ideas. When the writing demands surface writing skills, dictation is a simple English practice method. You will listen to an English audio clip, and your goal is to write down exactly what's being said. It is a highly effective way to improve English listening comprehension. Dictations force you to think about every word and sound that you are hearing. You will write down what you heard and then check your answers to conveniently see what you misunderstood. The dictating of words for another to write down, or accountable. Dictating the process of speaking for someone else to write down the words. Scoring is another matter. Depending on your context and purpose in administrating a dictation, you will need to decide on scoring criteria for several kinds of error. This is the several kinds of error. Spelling error only but the word appear to have been heard correctly. Spelling and or obvious misinterpretation of a word, illegible word. Grammatical error, skip word or phrase, permutation of words, additional words not in the original, replacement of a word with appropriate synonym. Communicative stimulus response test is also part of extensive listening. Test taker is presented with a stimulus monologues or conversation and then is asked to respond to a set of comprehension questions. The monologues or conversations and the multiple choice questions don't mirror communicative real-life situations. Another and more authentic example of extensive listening in which the test taker is presented with a stimulus, monologue or conversation and then is asked to respond to a set of comprehension questions. So, in authentic listening tests, the language assessment field would have a stockpile of listening test types that are connectively demanding, communicative, and authentic. Here are some possibilities. Note-taking. In the academic world, classroom lectures by a professor are common features of non-native English users' experience. Number 2. Editing. Another authentic test provides both written and a spoken stimulus and requires the test taker to listen for discrepancies. Interpretative test. One of the intensive listening tests described above was paraphrasing a story or conversation. And number 4, retelling. Test takers listen to a story or news event and simply retell it or summarize it, either oral or written. Authentic listening is a skill that requires practice and concentration. Authentic listening occurs when you respond to the speaker in ways that indicate to him or her that you care about what he or she is saying. And you give every opportunity to allow him or her to complete their train or thought. Number 1, note-taking. So note-taking, sometimes written as note-taking or note-taking, is the practice of recording information from different sources and platforms. By taking notes, the writer records the essence of the information, freeing their mind from having to recall everything. Well, here are 3 different note-taking styles: outline, visual, or choral. Outline and visual notes are quick upfront but require more work after class to make them useful, while choral notes take the most work upfront but are the most useful later on. So, in editing, an editing task that involves listening involves the student receiving reading material. The student reviews the reading material and then listens to a recording of someone reading aloud the same material. Number 3. The interpretive mode of communication gives learners opportunities to listen to, read, or view authentic materials. Learners demonstrate understanding of these materials on 2 levels: the literal and interpretive. At the literal level, Learners demonstrate that they can understand the surface meaning of the text. Thank you for listening to my report.